Hi, Marilyn. We decided to get on early just in case there were other people that were confused on that time, but it will start the recording. So I'll start out again on Mark Broman, the Executive Director of Wet'suwet'en Audubon. Wet'suwet'en is an independent chapter of the National Audubon with a geographic area covering 17 counties in Southeast Nebraska. You can follow us on our website or Facebook. And if everyone would mute themselves now until the end of the presentation, and then you can unmute yourselves and ask questions. But tonight it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. For the past 30 years, interpretive planner and birder Ted Lee Eubanks has worked from one edge of Nebraska to the other. Ted and his firm Fermata wrote the Platte River Recovery or Recreation Study and developed an interpretive strategy and signage for the Sandhills Journey Scenic Byway, which I'm sure most of you have seen those signs if you travel through the Sandhills. He also has spoken at tourism and economic development conferences throughout Nebraska. During the same 3 decades, Ted worked throughout the Great Plains from North Dakota to Central Texas, and his work has given him a unique perspective of nature and wildlife of the Great Plains, especially birds. As part of his presentation, Ted will focus on birds and wildlife of the Great Plains, especially Nebraska, and share some of his most memorable experiences during his career. Currently residing in Austin, Texas, Eubanks received a bachelor's degree in journalism. Oh, I think my internet's saying it's unstable. Can people still hear me? Okay, it's coming back on now. So he's received his BA in journalism from the University of Houston, and since 1984 has been involved in the founding and development of a series of businesses. He's a writer, photographer, an interpreter, a planner, and a noted public speaker. And I could go on and on with a lot more of his resume, but I think we'll let Ted begin his presentation. So Ted, thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for the invitation. What I thought I would do this evening, and I struggle with this, trying to think, what do I want to talk about when I talk about Nebraska? I want to focus really more to the West. I have spent, as was noted earlier, many years working in the Great Plains. And I want to talk about this whole area toward the Sandhills and sort of how I got started working there, but what my experiences have been like. I'm sure that all of you have spent time in the Sandhills, so this is not an unusual part of the world for you, but if this is going to be viewed on YouTube, maybe there are people that have never been to the Sandhills that will be enticed to go see this absolutely unique part of the world. So now what I've got to do, yes, I'm fine. When I first came to Nebraska to work, I had been there in the state before, and I think it was when I was serving on the National Audubon Society board. And I believe we had a board meeting in Kearney, and we went out to the Rose Sanctuary. This is long before the new building and all that stuff. It was still pretty crude, and we experienced, and I'm sure that was my first time experiencing the cranes on the Platte River, and I was truly just stunned by it all, just taken in by the experience. And I was lucky in that a few years later, the EPA contacted me and asked me if I'd be willing to do a nature recreation study on the Platte River as part of the reauthorization of the Kingsley Dam for Lake McConney. And I said I'd be willing to do that work. So I came in, I think I spent, 2 or 3 years working on that particular survey. That was really among the earliest of the non-consumptive recreation studies that had been done, and it is still referenced quite often in other people's papers. And we worked at that time sort of between Grand Island and Kearney the Rose Sanctuary, the Crane Trust, and we were looking at people that were there to birdwatch and the monies they were spending, the time they were spending, etc. So it was a fascinating study, and it was really focused on the Platte. And I really, at that time, knew very little about the Platte. I learned a lot very quickly in our project, particularly the state of the Platte, particularly at that time with all of the overgrowth and the risk to species such as piping plover and the least tern. But I also, in this study, we were looking at everything. So we're looking at sandhill cranes during the spring. We're looking at Franklin's gulls. We're looking at a broad range of species that people were coming to the Platte River to see, to enjoy. And that report was published in '98. We also looked at consumptive recreation, hunting and fishing, and that was published in '99, maybe 2000. And then, maybe 10 years after that, 10 years, I can't remember. I was contacted by your Department of Transportation and asked if I'd be willing to work with the Sandhills Journey Scenic Byway and write an interpretive plan, which is really develop an approach by which we could tell the story of the Sandhills. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about this evening, is that experience and what I did and what I think we accomplished and the value of this absolutely unique ecological region. Some of you have been to the visitor center where the byway, on the byway, we developed the interpretive plan, but we also developed all the signage along there. In fact, you'll see some of these pictures later on in my presentation that are on this particular sign. Let's talk about the Sandhills for a minute. It covers about a quarter of your state, which I think is remarkable, that it's about 25% of the state of Nebraska. Those ancient sand dunes are made of sediment from, as you know, from the erosion of the Rockies, which washed out onto the plains and are, where we're lucky, they're stabilized by grassland vegetation. But as you know, in this part of the world, we get blowouts at the top of some of the great dunes, and we have some very unique species that grow in the blowouts as well. The Sandhills is the largest sand dune formation in America. So in that way, just in that way, it's absolutely unique in this country. It's the large, but I think this would maybe surprise me when I started spending a lot of time in the Sandhills. It's also the largest and most intricate wetland ecosystem in the US. I remember starting to spend lots of time in the Sandhills, and I would just go mile after mile, and there would be a dune, and then there would be a little pond, and there would be a dune and another pond. And it was, I was just overwhelmed by the amount of water and the marshes that were in the Sandhills. These marshes, as you know, this ecosystem replenishes the Ogallala, thank goodness, given how much water we're drawing out of the Ogallala to the south. So let's see here. So here's a map of the Ogallala. And look where it centers. Look where that recharge zone centers, right in the sandhills. The Ogallala extends all the way into Texas, and all along that way, it's water's being drawn for irrigation. But if you look in Nebraska, all of that depends on the waters that are being recharged in your state. So several of the states in the Great Plains are hoping you're getting good rainfall this year. As much, here we go, as much as 85% of the sandhills is still in intact natural habitat, which is the highest level in the Great Plains. I've also done a similar project in the Flint Hills of Kansas, so I know the two. It's remarkable how much of the sandhills is still intact. And a lot of that due to these private landowners, private ranchers who still are maintaining ranches that maybe have been in their families 4 or 5 generations. I actually stayed out on ranches with people who had been there for that time. So let's talk about this unbelievably beautiful, remarkable part of your state, 25% of your state. And again, the reason I'm focused on it is because that's the Great Plains region of the state. I have in my work, I'm sure you know the highways, but 281 and 183, the two that run north-south, run all the way to South Texas and run all the way to Canada. I have worked the entire length of those two highways. And so I'm focused on that area, and we'll focus on some of the birds of that area that I have become enamored with. Now, in my work, what I'm looking at is trying to understand this place. When somebody hires me to come into a place like the Sandhills, the first thing I have to do is understand it as a place. And it's not unusual for me to be brought into an area that I know absolutely nothing about. For example, a few years ago, I did a whole series of birding and nature trails for the Caribbean. So I'm working in Antigua and Jamaica and the Dominican Republic and places like that. And I don't know much at all about them. So my first challenge is I want to know how this place is endowed with value. How am I to look at this place? I think some of you may recognize this river. This is the Dismal. I believe the Dismal's 70 miles long, I think the total, but it's one of my favorite rivers out in that part of the state. So I have to understand, when I'm looking out at this landscape, how do I endow that with value? How do I explain that to people? How do I get people involved in that? I think most importantly, how do I get people involved in its protection and making sure it continues into the future? Place involves meanings and values that really facilitate connections with these geographical areas. Do you all recognize this church?
Is that in
This is the
Anselmo?
church you bet, it's Anselmo. One of my favorite places along the route. And so I want to understand the value of that small community and how it connects to the byway, and then how it connects to this larger ecosystem. Why did people settle here? What were they growing? Where did they come from? As you all know, and this is particularly true in my work in Kansas, the more I've worked in Kansas, and I did all of the 11 byways in Kansas, I'm just astonished by all of the immigrant groups and where they came from and the places they settled and what their backgrounds were. And so I'm always looking for all of the details, not just the birds, everything associated with this part of the world. What I'm looking for is in my work in interpretation is we pierce the superficial, just that facade, and we get to the narrative that lies behind that facade. So even though I may be looking at a redhead, the fact is this redhead is one of those ducks that's, breeding in this part of the world, and 90 some odd percent of those winter in the lower Laguna Madre of my home state. So there's a story to be told, even in one duck. With one duck, I can tell a very complex story about the ecosystem. Let's look at this quickly. This is Walter Prescott Webb, who was a historian at the University of Texas, wrote the first great book on the Great Plains. And he said the historical truth that becomes apparent in the end is that the Great Plains have bent and molded Anglo-American life, have destroyed traditions, and have influenced institutions in a most singular manner. His argument is, and I happen to agree with it, is as we settled this country, we settled on the east, and then we settled in the far west, and then we filled in the middle. We weren't sure how to settle in the Great Plains. And I'll give you an example. He focused on the 98th meridian, but I'm more focused, let me go back, on the 100th. If you look to the left, can you see my arrow? Here's the 100th, and here's the 98th. Well, Nebraska is defined by both. As you well know, along the 98th, when I get east of the 98th, things change dramatically when it comes to things like moisture, rainfall. When you get west and you start going west of the 100th, it becomes much, much drier. So agricultural practices, for example, in the east no longer worked. We could no longer have the same type of agriculture that we had when we settled in the east. And so he focused in that area. The Great Plains they're comparatively level. Now, I grew up on an island that has an elevation of 6 feet. And so elevation on Galveston Island is measured in inches, not in feet. So I've always said to people in Kansas and Nebraska and other states in the Great Plains, you're not flat. You're not flat the way I know flat. But I understand it's a relatively level land surface. It's relatively treeless, particularly in the past. And it's subhumid when we get toward the east, and then it gets really semi-arid as we go to the west. And so let's look at this sort of chart here. In the east, if we planted the old crops, they withered and died. So we had to come up with new irrigation techniques and new hybrids in the west. You couldn't depend on water travel. You're not going to, except for the Missouri. In the west, the rivers are very shallow. So then you depended on horses and then ultimately railroad. You couldn't build wood or stone houses where there was no wood and no stone. And so the original pioneers built soddies, or in some places, adobe. You couldn't build fences without wood. So ultimately, barbed wire was invented. Fresh food and available water was difficult. So foods were dried. And then ultimately, the Western windmill, the Great Plains windmill was invented. Uh, the sorts of clothing that people wore to work the ranches, which were small in the East, were large in the West. So we had to develop things like Western boots or adopt them. They were really Spanish and then Mexican, and saddles. And then even weapons like the Kentucky rifle or single shot. We had to develop new types of weapons in the West. So in the Great Plains, things changed dramatically, and it changed the country dramatically. Here's a good example of, I think this was outside of Anselmo. I don't know if this place is still there, that had all these windmills, but it was a wonderful place for photography. And so it's an iconic American landscape. And I've always wanted people in Nebraska to understand that this is iconic. This is really one of a kind, a land that fundamentally changed the way we view the country and ourselves. Okay, so I was brought in to work on the Sandhills Journey Scenic Byway. The first thing that struck me about the byway is that I've done lots of byways. I've never done a byway as long as the Sandhills Journey Scenic Byway. This byway goes from Grand Island to Alliance. So to drive that byway in a day is a challenge, but it's worth it. It is truly worth it because it gives you a chance of moving, as I said, from that, what we saw as being that eastern landscape. And then as you're leaving Grand Island, you're moving more and more toward the west. And by the time you get to Alliance, and if you're willing to go on to Scotts Bluff, you're truly entering the beginnings of the West and really, looking at on the beginnings of the Rockies. And so it's a extraordinary opportunity to see something definitive about our country. Now, if you're a birder, it's also a place where you're going to see things that are definitive about our bird life. And that's what I love about it, is the way you're moving from Eastern bird life to Western bird life. And you see that in that one drive. And particularly as these small towns have been settled and trees were planted, Eastern birds tended to move to the west. You all know the story of bullocks and Baltimore Oriole and hybridization initially, and now we've split them back. But the fact is, that's what happened. Suddenly this gap was filled with trees in these settlements, and some birds moved to the west. And you have these remarkable places. In this case, it's to the northwest of Alliance, but like Sow Belly Canyon, which I hope you've all been to, right? Everybody's birded there. You have to. It is just a remarkable place where you're seeing, Western tanagers and ovenbirds, and if you're lucky, you'll get a Clark's nutcracker, but then you get Eastern birds too. You get this just complete mixture, this strange, exotic mixture of East and West in one place. To me, that's the story about Nebraska. That's the story of the Great Plains. It's where the two extremes, East and West, mix. And it gives us a chance as birders to experience both. So we have grassland birds. Certainly in the Sandhills, it's hard to imagine anything more common than the grasshopper sparrow, particularly during nesting. It is an absolutely abundant bird. It's not an abundant bird everywhere in this country. So this is a great place to study something like that, this particular bird. It's also a place, and I'm going to have fun with this because I'm going to ask you which one is which. I'm going to test you. Which one is Eastern and which one is Western? Um, but the fact is, as you know, you get Eastern meadowlark on the east side, and then as you're moving, you'll start hearing the song change, and you're getting into Western meadowlark territory by the end of the byway. Uh, and I think it's a wonderful place to study these two meadowlarks because you get to really in a single day or a week, if you're going to stay there for some period of time, you get to study both and spend time with them. Anybody want to guess?
Is the right one the Eastern?
Yes, you
All right.
passed. All right. Yeah, the facial pattern, you can see the difference, but it is, I will tell you, it's tough. I've looked at them very, very closely a long time, and it can still be difficult. Great. And we have introduced grassland birds. It depends on the time of year and rainfall, but yeah, ringneck pheasant. I've gone across ranches where they are just absolutely abundant. So this is certainly a bird that has adapted well to this area, particularly in the sandhills where we do have a lot of moisture. Birds like Swainson's hawk, which is, certainly a common nesting bird where it can find the proper woodland habitat, where it can find trees. And then upland sandpiper, which I think is, if I were going to have a state bird, I think I would have upland as my state bird. I just love this particular shorebird, and it is as you know, a relatively common breeding bird out in that part of the world. It migrates through our area. When I was growing up on Galveston Island, at night we could hear them, that wonderful sound of uplands moving south, but they're moving south from you and the Great Plains. And of course, at the time, I'm not even sure I knew that. I had no idea where they were coming from, but I certainly loved them from the beginning. And then there's things like this, which of course are they're a common wintering bird down in my area, but of course in the Great Plains they're a common breeding bird, long-billed curlew, which I find really to be extraordinary when I think about that particular migration. That Great Plains migration for many of these shorebirds like piping plover, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is very quick. These birds migrate very fast. They will often wait into the first good cold front, and we're all waiting for it. But when that first good cold front comes, they'll ride those winds and make this trip to the Texas coast very quickly. Texas coast, northern Mexico, in some cases, obviously, much farther. But for those that breed in the Great Plains, they migrate in winter not that far away. Well, for us, it's far away, but into southern Texas, northern Mexico. This is one of those birds that I would see fairly no, not frequently, but it's another bird that struggled like the piping plover because of loss of sandbar habitat in the rivers, particularly the Platte. And this is Lee's tern, interior Lee's tern. And that's like the plover, it needs open sandbar habitat to lay its eggs. It makes a little scrape, just a little depression in the sand, and lays its eggs. And one of the great problems with, as you know, with like the Platte, when you start building dams, you no longer have the scouring effect of floods or particularly ice. I remember being in Kearney and someone telling me, or I was reading in their library, of a description of when the ice would break on the Platte, and you could hear the roar miles away as the ice would start to break, and it's just scouring all the shoreline along the Platte, removing all vegetation. Well, then it's providing this wonderful habitat for things like piping plover and Lee's tern. And of course, that's changed. And so thank goodness for Audubon and Crane Trust and others who are working overtime to remove a lot of this vegetation and to provide breeding habitat for species such as the Lee's tern. We have Lee's terns that nest here too, and they nest on our beaches, and we have just as much trouble. Our trouble is people going to the beach in their cars. And we're all, we go down and rope off and tie off areas where the terns have decided to nest. And of course, they change every year. Interestingly, in some years, they'll nest on gravel roofs downtown in buildings in Galveston. I wish they would choose that more frequently because it's easy to protect them there. But it's the same challenge, is that these birds need a habitat that is fragile. It's easy to lose if we're not careful. Okay, here it is. The shorebirds that breed in Nebraska, particularly up in the Northwest, in the sandhills because of the water, both Wilson's phalarope and avocets. I think Wilson's phalarope is obviously one of my favorites. When you find them out in a pothole or one of those things, that type of habitat. And again, these are both birds. In the case of the avocet, it comes down in my area in winters. Phalaropes migrate through. If you ever want to drive just a short distance to Cheyenne Bottoms in Kansas, if you're lucky, you can see literally in migration of the phalaropes, 20,000 Wilson's phalaropes in one giant gathering. But we have to remember where they nested. Where did they breed? Well, they bred from northwestern, north central Nebraska north. And so Nebraska is incredibly important for this prairie pothole country, and having that habitat available for birds like this. I don't have to tell you the importance of prairie potholes to these types of ducks. And certainly many organizations have been involved in trying to restore these numbers, these populations, and I think have done a really extraordinary job. The only thing we're ever dependent on is rainfall, and so we're all sitting around, thinking about now what's the impact of the change in climate, and how is that going to affect rainfall? Is it going to increase it, decrease it? What's going to happen? I don't have an answer. I don't have a clue, but I think that that the pothole ducks have, depending on the year, have done really well over my 40 some odd years of following this sort of thing and being involved in it professionally. There are also these marsh birds. And I like them both. People, yes, I know red-winged blackbird is a common bird. And, here's this guy from Texas giving a talk on red-winged blackbirds, but I could give a talk on red-winged blackbirds because I think they're extraordinary. But where they're really extraordinary is in your part of the world. They do nest in my area, but I love to come up to the northern Great Plains and see them, where you have so many gathered in one large wetland area. Now, yellow-headed blackbirds do not breed where I am, but and that's a good reason to make a trip up to Nebraska or Kansas, where I can sit out there and just listen to these bizarre calls, the most bizarre vocalizations of any bird. I love the way they look. I mean, they're a beautiful bird. I love the way they sound even more. I could just sit out there and listen to them for hours. But these are marsh birds, and without the marsh, we don't have these. And so I think that's another really important aspect about the sandhills, this whole area of your state, not just that area. I mean, certainly in the east as well. But these are absolutely singular habitats in the Great Plains that hopefully we will be able to protect into the future. Let's look at a couple of more marsh birds. To the left is willet. This is the western willet. The eastern willet, eastern subspecies, is on the Gulf Coast. And that's the bird that I know. And if you spend enough time around both eastern and western willets, you'll be able to tell them apart, I promise you. Someday they'll split them, I'm convinced. But western willet is the one in your area, up in the northern area. And this particular picture I took is my favorite because, not my favorite picture, but this is my favorite plumage. This is a juvenile. This is a young bird. And it is a extraordinarily crisp plumage with a beautiful color to it. It's hard to imagine describing a willet as being colorful, but I'm going to try, or at least attempt to say that it's a pretty colorful bird in this particular plumage. And then of course black terns. I think of Nebraska in the late August, early September, down on the Texas coast where I grew up. There's an area called San Luis Pass, and I can go down. It's a large sand flat, huge sand flat that's at the end of Galveston Island. And during migration, there will be literally 20,000 black terns, 20,000 black terns staging there. And then every morning they get up and go out into the Gulf. And if you're on a boat, as far as you can see, you'll see black terns. The Gulf is just covered with black terns. And I always think about where they came from. For them, I guess it's a short trip because they continue on, but it is truly a remarkable migration, and one that I think every birder in Nebraska should be familiar with. when you see things like black tern, you should think about its life cycle, where it's going. You know, it's here briefly, breeding, but when you think about how far it's going to migrate, it's an extraordinary story. One of the things that I've become more familiar with and more interested in the older I have gotten is the fact that there are these Serengeti-like massings of wildlife in our country that nobody knows about, that aren't just a handful of birders know, but by and large, the public is not aware of. And if you remember, I think a few of you are at my age, that if you remember, I think it was didn't National Geographic do an article on the sandhill cranes that kind of opened up people's eyes to the Platte River and the gathering of the cranes on the Platte River? That would have been quite a few years ago. But if you remember, that really did get people coming. There are other gatherings like this, and this is one of them. These are all Franklin's gulls, and that's a very small portion of the entire flock. There were literally tens of thousands gathered on this lake before they migrate south. And that happens every year. It happens in Nebraska. It particularly happens on Tuttle Lake in Kansas, but nobody knows about it. You know, nobody rushes to the lake to see 100,000 Franklin's gulls gathered on one lake. Yet I think it's, you know, no offense, but I think it's just as spectacular as sandhills. This is an amazing gathering of birds. I'll give you another example. Look at these three pelicans in this lake where you see Franklin's gulls as far as you can see. It is truly a remarkable Great Plains experience, and it's one that Nebraska shares. And so Kansas has started keeping up with this, but started to try to keep counts. And I would hope Nebraska is doing the same in some of these great massings. When I know you do that with snow geese, but there's certainly other species that gather in these immense flocks that we should be really paying attention to. And I think Franklin's gull is one. I mean, it's a Great Plains bird. It's not going to nest nowhere else. So I think we should be trying to find out what are the lakes where they're gathering. How many are gathering year to year? I think that would be something that Audubon could think about taking on, because first of all, it's an amazing experience just to be around these great gatherings of birds. But also it's very important. The population in the Great Plains states is small. We don't have lots of birders in the Great Plains, not like East and West. And so we need everybody possible that's monitoring these numbers. What lake is the biggest gathering lake in your state? Do you know?
Well, we have a couple, Ted, Branched Oak for some species, and then Lake McConaughey and Harlan Reservoir over by Alma. So it just depends upon the species, but there's, pelicans come in by the hundreds to Alma, to Harlan County Reservoir.
What about Franklin's?
I know Branched Oak gets a lot. I'm not sure, probably Sherman Reservoir.
Okay. That'd be something that would be fun to try to see where they are, because they really do mass up feed and then move on south. Now, obviously, snow geese more toward the east, but there are extraordinary numbers I've noticed in the last, I don't know what, 15, 20 years of snow geese that have that tend to short stop and overwinter, where they used to come to my area, for example. The number of snow geese in some of the areas that in my state have actually decreased, and I think it's because they short stop and they just stay north of us. And that's certainly the case. And if you look, yeah, you'll have no problem seeing Ross geese in this flock on my picture. That's another bird that has been an amazing story of when I was young. That was a rare bird in my part of the world. And now Ross has become often in flocks as common as snows. Is that the same as in your area?
I think you could say that in Nebraska.
Yeah, yeah, you're getting as many Ross. It's an amazing bird. Okay, so now then the winter residents in this part of the world. Now juncos are everywhere, so I don't have to, but things like tree sparrow, of course, that barely makes it into Texas. That's a bird that's not in my state. So that's the sort of bird that people are going to travel north to see in the winter. Certainly Harris sparrow doesn't go east or west. It's in the Great Plains, nests in the Canada, but it stays in our area. And then, of course, if we're lucky, really lucky, we have good flight years for snowy owl. And I photographed this bird right outside of Lincoln. Don't ask me the year. I don't remember, but this was a snowy owl that was, typical for a young bird, stupidly tame, I'll say. They need to be less tame. They need to be far more careful when they're around highways, etc. But you think about some of those great flight years when we get just really good numbers of snowies in the Great Plains. And that, again, that's another bird that barely makes it into Texas. If we get one record a decade, that's newsworthy. Now, when you're on the Sandhills journey, scenic byway, it doesn't mean you're locked into the highway. You can get off, and you can go to places like this, which is what I'm not going to say this is my favorite place in Nebraska, because the Sandhills, I think, is my favorite, although the Platte River may be. I don't know. I'd sit down and probably give you 20 favorite places. But I certainly love Toadstool, the state park. I love spending every moment in the times I've been there and been able to hike around it and look at it closely. So, that it's a remarkable habitat, a remarkable geological formation, which then, of course, attracts an interesting number of birds. And then, of course, Scotts Bluff, which is in that very corner. And then I love that drive coming out of Scotts Bluff, going north, going up toward the very corner of the state where when I compare that, when you think of that corner, and then I think about going back toward Omaha and Lincoln, think of the difference. Just think of how remarkably different those areas are within the single state. It is like my state of Texas, where we have all these different habitats. But that, I think, is one of the things that makes Nebraska so remarkable, is it has this incredible diversity um, that people can enjoy in a single state. And this is the last time I was in your state. My wife and I decided, I know Nebraska pretty well, and I know where that eclipse is going to be. So we're going to drive up there. So we did. It turns out my wife had to work up there for a couple of days, but I can't remember the town we were in. I hate to say that, but they had set up an area around their elementary school, and we just joined the people in town and sat around and set up and enjoyed the eclipse. And it was a truly remarkable experience, not just because of the eclipse, but because what the town had done to make sure that everybody enjoyed it and everybody got to see it. It was truly incredible. And we've got another one coming up, and that one's going to come through my town, going to come through Austin. So now you're going to have to go south to see it this time, but I thoroughly enjoyed going north to enjoy it there. Now, if you're interested in any more of this information, here's all my stuff, all my contact information. I still have all the reports I've done from Nebraska, and am still doing reports, still doing a lot of interpretive work, although my work now, I think I'm doing a interpretive plan for a slave quarters in Austin, and in doing an interpretive plan for an old Catholic cemetery. So my work changes. It goes from birds to cemeteries. It doesn't matter. I'm interested in all of it. But this is how you can get in touch with me. And now this is going to be on YouTube, right? So
Yes.
people can get in touch with me there. And are there any questions?
Yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. I don't see it in the chat room, but if anybody has a question, go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up.
Did you know Paul Johnsgard or Jane Goodall?
Yes and yes.
And did you have any good stories?
Well, I knew Jane I've met twice, so I don't know her well. It's just that we met in, meetings, etc. But I spent Paul talking about what I was doing and what he was doing, and just sharing, I think, his love and my love for that your part of the world. Although I think his love was, because of his connection to this place, and mine as a visitor. But we had a couple of times we got to spend hours together. Yeah.
So what does your company's name mean, Fermata?
Good question. If you look at that symbol above the name, it's a musical symbol. And on a score of music, it means stop until the conductor tells you to move forward. And 35 years ago, I thought that was really profound. And now I'm stuck with it. So it is what it is.
Nice and simple and memorable.
It is simple, yes. Any other questions?
When would you look for the Franklin gulls?
Fall. After they've nested and they're gathering up before they move south, they come in great gatherings, massings on these interior lakes. And what we see where I am is just endless flights of them coming over, but they move through. my area. But in your area, like I said, like around Tuttle Lake, down around K-State, they'll mass and literally in the hundreds of thousands. You just can't imagine how many birds, how many Franklin's gulls can be on one lake. And I think it's a great challenge to people in your state and in Kansas and others to start making sure we know where all those lakes are, where they're gathering up. Because this is, I don't remember even hearing of this when I was first birding. This is something I've started hearing about from people like Dave Rintoul and others down in Kansas who said, whoa, wait a minute. Ted Cable, would go out and say, oh, there's only about 75,000 Franklin's gulls on the lake this morning. And I couldn't believe it, but that's what's happening. They're gathering in these huge massings. And it would be great to locate those in Nebraska.
So it's spring migration?
Fall.
Fall.
In spring, they're flying in. They're just endless flights of them. You've seen them, and if you go out in like the Sandhills, you can drive into one little town and you'll just see these flights of Franklins coming over. But in the fall, they're gathering up, and I think probably massing, feeding before they take out and head south. Remember, they have a long migration. They're largely wintering off the west coast of Pacific coast of South America. So they have quite a flight.
Dean Cole's got a question. Dean, go ahead.
Yeah, when you talk about migration and water and the Ogallala Aquifer, do you predict there's going to be a big migration of people back to the Great Plains, especially since what we're seeing in the Northwest and California and the big water issues? Are you concerned about that, or is that something we need to be concerned about? What is your prediction reference that?
Boy, that's a little out of my expertise, but I will give you my opinion. Yes, I believe there'll be a movement. It's already started. There are lots of those people moving to Austin, Texas with our high tech. Unfortunately, the water is not moving with them. We're not, at this moment, we're not a lot better off. But when I think about areas in the Great Plains and the changes, and if you notice what happened with COVID and people working from home, and now people are still doing that. We haven't rushed back to the office in a lot of places. I think the Great Plains is going to be an interesting destination for a lot of people. I really do.
Ted, I don't know if you saw recently on the news, but they're talking about the Great Lakes that are drying up in the West, and they're having problems with heavy metals like arsenic and other things with the shorebirds. They're starting to concentrate, that water. And so they're having some real issues with the bird die-offs in some of those lakes because of that.
Yeah, I saw that. That's, if we'll see. I mean, I have no, I'm no predictor of the rate of climate change, but I think when you look at the Great Plains and places like the Sandhills, which are still intact, we still have this huge, immense sponge out there that can capture that water. As long as we have that, I think we'll be okay. My only worry is we lose it.
What I thought the aquifer in Texas, I thought that was not doing very well, but
Oh, the Ogallala?
in Texas.
Oh yeah, it's because we irrigate with that water and we just keep pumping it out. We depend on you soaking it up and sending it to us. But I think there's a limit to that. there's a limit to how much we can pump out. And I think we have to be very, very cautious about that. The secret is to pay very, very close attention to Nebraska and its rainfall and how much is being taken into the Ogallala. I think that should be the rule. We will pump based on what we took in.
Well, we'll see if we have one more question from the audience. Do we have one more question out there for Ted? Linda Brown, go ahead.
I have a memory of you, Ted,
Uh-oh.
and I'm going to share it because it's kind of a birdie story. In 1999, I was involved in helping to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Nebraska Ornithologists Union.
Mhm.
And I'm quite sure you came to Lincoln for that.
I did.
I remember you out on a bird walk in Wilderness Park. At that day, we saw a Blackburnian warbler, my first one. But what I remember about you is I heard this interesting sound and I talked about it. Of course, I couldn't find the bird, but you said maybe it would be a saw-whet owl. And at that point, I had no idea if there were saw-whet owls in Nebraska. But in the Nebraska Ornithologist Union bird review that just came, they're actually studying the saw-whet owls that come back and forth into Nebraska. So I just
Right.
thank you for
remember
your
that.
long interest.
I remember that day. I do remember that walk, actually. And yes, that's what's happening. I'll give you a short story. I worked up in the UP of Michigan and worked in that very far north area up there. And there's a birding center up there. And one night, some guy that was banding up there during the daytime forgot and left his nets up at night.
Oh my God.
He just forgot to close them. So about 3 a.m, he remembered and he jumped up and got, in his car and drove back there so he could close them up. And his net was, there were both boreal and saw-whet owls in his net.
Oh my
And
God.
since that time, they've been banding. And now they realize they have a huge flight of saw-whet. And these other owls, they're just really able to hide. They're quiet. And so we just don't know they're around. I wouldn't be surprised if Nebraska doesn't have quite a few. I really would be
Wow.
every year, but how do you find them? That's the problem.
We used to go up to Northwest Iowa because there was a man up there that knew exactly where they were and he could show us, but it was always the coldest darn time of the year. And I wondered how those cute little things could even make it through that super cold time of year. And he would pull back the branch and show us, and that little owl would just sit there and look at us. And it was so cute.
Oh, I know they're the famous owls, but there's no telling how many move through Nebraska. But you would have to really do what they're doing in other places, which is you have throughout the migratory season, you band every night, and it's cold and it's miserable, and not many people want to do that.
When I was young, in my backyard, I lived on Randolph Street. There were no less than 9 of them sitting on the fence between me and my neighbor's place. And they sat there for like a couple of evenings. I mean, we were out sitting there and the neighbor was out sitting there watching them. And I could get fairly close to them. They'd sit there and look at me. Eventually they headed toward, I think, Wyuka Cemetery, where there's a whole lot of trees and what have you, but they were in my backyard for several evenings. And I had to look it up to see what they were. And they were saw-whet owls.
Cemeteries are good places to find them, believe it or not.
Oh yeah.
They really are. If you walk a cemetery and look for their droppings. look for staining on the trunks of the trees. It's the same thing with long-eared owl. I mean, how can an owl that big hide? They're really good. They're really good at hiding.
Well, I think that's a good way to end the evening on owls, Ted, and thank you very much for giving us your talk tonight. And everyone, I'm sure appreciates it. We'll give you a round of applause.
Well, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed being with y'all again.
Thanks for being part of Nebraska for another evening.
Oh, yeah. Bye-bye.
We'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.